well. So without further ado, the theme of this year's conference or seminar is New Directions in Scholarly Publishing Models, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And to kick us off and introduce the keynote speaker, I'd like to introduce Sophie Riez from the SSP Education Committee.
Good morning, everyone. Not to put Melanie on the spot, but my last name is Rice. I just recently got married, so I'm practicing. But thank you all for being here. It's so lovely to see a full house at this seminar and some familiar faces as well. It is my pleasure to speak on behalf of the team, the committee that organized the seminar, and I'd like to just say another shout out, and if the team feels comfortable, please stand up as I say your name. Tom Thrash, Simone Taylor, Sylvia Hunter, Kelly Newton, Heather Staines, John Shaw, Greg Suprock, and of course, Mary Beth Barilla. Please join me in applauding them. Thank you all for making this happen, and without further delay, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Rachel Burley. She is the president of Research Square, and we are very excited to welcome her to the seminar today. And she will be kicking us off with her keynote address titled The New Normal, where she will speak to the ever-changing landscape of publication and peer review models and different revenue streams, the growing reality that publishers should be open and agile when it comes to considering and adapting new technologies and new opportunities for change, and the importance of not losing sight of authors, researchers, and young scientists, while also focusing on the needs of librarians and institutions. So without further delay, please welcome Rachel to the stage.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And so good morning, everyone. And thank you also to Simone Taylor for inviting me and the SSP for having me today. I've just bumped into a few people outside who said they're really looking forward to my talk, so I feel like the expectation's quite high. So I wanted to just start by introducing myself a bit more. So I actually am now the president for Research Square and have been for 2 weeks. So it's a relatively new position. And before that, I was at Springer Nature for 3 years, where most of my time there was spent overseeing the BMC group, the Biomed Central group. And I was publishing director for that group for, can you hear me okay? Is that better? Okay, I'll project. So the title of this talk is very much in keeping with my own view of the way that research communication happens. It's been fairly stable for a number of decades, but in fact, I believe now that we're going to face a period of significant change, quite radical change, as many of you know, and we're talking about in later sessions today. But I don't think, one thing I think is not clear is one single direction that the industry will go. And I think with the title being New Directions in the plural is quite right, because I think there's a lot of possibilities and it's really not certain at this point where we'll end. But it is clear to me that all of the stakeholders in research communications and scholarly publishing will need to be braced for continuous change, hence the new normal. And that, in fact, this is not a bad thing. There's opportunities as well as risks. And what I wanted to really do is just talk a bit more about that and push a bit on some of the boundaries of what that might mean for us as an industry. So I've been working in research publishing for a long time, and many of you have as well. And the talk of disruption has been around for a long time, for at least 10 years. People have been waiting for this event. We're going to have a disrupted industry, and everybody needs to be ready for that. But actually, it hasn't happened like that. If you look back over the history of open access, Biomed Central was the first OA publisher, launched in 2001, and that was a full 18 years ago. And I think hybrid OA was launched in 2004 by Springer at the time with their compact deal. So this has been a lengthy process to get us to where we are now. And I think back then, when open access was new and nascent, publishers sort of had their eye on what this might do for them, but nobody was really taking it seriously as being a sort of game changer. And I think, it's been the launch of PLOS One and the sort of rise of the mega journal from 2006 on was the point when most of the bigger publishers and societies actually said, okay, this is a real thing, it's going to become mainstream, and we need to react. So I think what's happened since then is there's been this huge growth in submissions as a result of that, of open access and of things like PLOS One, which had this novel peer review process, just checking for technical soundness and not for novelty. And that's been part of the reason I think that we've had a big increase in research output and submissions to journals. So if you fast forward to 2018, the percentage of content that's published open access is still relatively low. It's actually quite hard to put a figure on it. People have tried. I found 23% somewhere online. I think it could be higher than that. But what we do know is it's less than half, and this is a full 18 years after its advent. And so this, I think, is the reason for funders and Coalition S and others to say, okay, this isn't happening fast enough, and we need to do something to make the industry sit up and take notice and accelerate the process. And for those of us who work in publishing, I believe that this is, well, for me at least, this has felt like at some points quite a hostile attack on our industry and on what we do. And the messaging around that has been, you feel under a certain amount of pressure that the onus is on publishers to accelerate this change and to do everything needed to make it happen. So on the face of it, you sort of would think, well, why isn't it easier? Why can't we just flip everything to open access? There's money in the system, so let's just allocate it differently. And I think that's what some of the funders and others that are asking us to do that are thinking. But actually, as we know, this is a hugely complex system, and there's a lot of stakeholders in it, and it's really difficult to just change one piece or one part of the model without everybody being at the table and collaborating to make those changes happen. So I think actually what was interesting to me was the feedback that I'm sure people in this room and others in the industry gave to the Coalition S, the Plan S funders, was actually, I think, quite game-changing for us as an industry, because what I saw happening was a kind of getting around the table and saying, well, okay, so we understand why you want this change, but in actual fact, the speed and the timeline that's been set and some of the knock-on impacts and the unintended consequences need greater thought. And that was instrumental in the revised guidance, and I think that's a really good thing. I suspect most of you are thinking it's still not enough time, and 2021 is very close. But I think it does show how you can, you have to be at the table and you have to be engaging in the conversations in order to be able to influence and make change. So I think this is really just saying, I think what I'm saying here is that actually this is the sign you're looking for that change is coming, and I think we all know that, and I think it's an indicator that we're just going to need to be continually evolving in order to meet the needs of the constituents that we serve. So if we look into a bit more detail about why is it so hard, and I know, I'm talking to an audience of very well-informed people here, but I think it's worth just covering again to tee us up for conversations that come later in the day. So essentially it is the complexity, and I'm always kind of interested when people join the publishing industry, the scholarly publishing industry from other organizations, that they come in with great ideas about how they're going to shape this sleepy old industry and shake us all up and show us how to do it. But actually, it's not as simple as that. And after a very short period of time, they're kind of saying, well, hang on a minute, this isn't as easy as I thought. And even if everybody, universities, funders, researchers, librarians, and the general public believes in open access and believes that it's the right thing to do, there is no one single approach, and there's no one method that will suit all of the different stakeholders. So this is why it's so complex. So in my previous role, some of the slides here were prepared before I changed affiliation. So I've had permission from Springer Nature to continue to use those. But in my previous role at Springer Nature, part of the group that I was working in was the Open Research Group. And as you know, Springer Nature are the largest publisher in open access. We had the Biomed Central Group, also Scientific Reports, Nature Communications. But even with all of that, and even being very successful in open access with all that content, in 2018, it was still less than 30% of everything that was published. So why is this? The reason for this is actually that the demand for open access is not as high as we'd like it to be. And I think this is the flip side of saying, publishers, you need to make things change. Well, actually, authors need to want to publish open access. Otherwise, we can't make them. And this is a routine survey that all authors, published authors for Springer Nature receive. In 2018, 28,000, just under 28,000 authors completed it. And as part of that survey, they were asked to indicate the top 3 reasons that they chose the journal they did to publish in. And this shows the results. And, it's clear that open access is second from bottom on the list. And even if you look at the authors that are funded by the Coalition S funders or the EU, or funders where there is a clear or mandated policy and it's been well communicated, it's still only 9%. So we know that authors choose where to publish by relevance, reputation, impact factor, and those things still come ahead of choosing open access. And then global variations in policy are another confounding factor for why this is so complicated. And we read about this every day. There's, some new piece of news about funder policies or about institutions that are trying to make changes to the way their research gets communicated. But it's a very mixed bag of approaches. And as we know in Europe, there are national funders that are encouraging gold open access and providing dedicated funds. And there are consortia, especially in Northwest Europe, that are really driving for this. But it's different in other regions. And, even if that may change up until this point in North America, it's been a green open access approach to encouraging authors to self-archive. And just a few funders sort of really pushing on. So Gates Foundation sort of being part of Coalition S and supporting gold, but definitely at the moment in the minority. And in China, it's very mixed, and I think there's no clear sign at the moment of no evidence of a concrete move, even if there are some indications that it's supportive of Plan S and other initiatives, but no concrete moves. So another complexity is that currently the subscription fees and licensing fees cover content that's not primary research. And, I think this is something that doesn't get much attention, and I think it should. And for people in the room who work on journals that have front half content, you'll be familiar with this, but there's a lot of content that just is free with the subscription fee. So including things like podcasts, news and views, research highlights. This is all there is no model currently to separate that from primary research in a single journal. And so I think for publishers, we have to figure out, well, what is the model for that in a world where everything's, the money's all around the primary research? Who's paying for this content? And we know it's valuable and we know people want it. So there will have to be some model that that a subscription model maybe that will cover this content. There's a kind of beeping going on, but I'm assuming it's not something telling me to get off, but let me know if it is. So I think it's interesting, as research output increases, so do submissions to journals. And, I've seen this in my previous role at Springer Nature, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there's increased revenue. And, some of the more selective journals may be receiving more submissions and processing more content, but it's not necessarily increasing the acceptance rate. So this is another challenge for selective journals. If you're receiving thousands and thousands of submissions and only 5% of them are getting published, the simple fact is that the paying customers are paying for the rejected manuscripts as well as as part of their costs that they're paying, and so we can't get away from that. And we know that curation and dissemination of content is enormously valuable to the community. And so this selectivity means that in a fully open access world without some kind of submission fee, the APCs for highly selective journals would be incredibly high. Which brings me on to business models. So I know there's more later today about business models, but I did just want to give mention to this because I think there's a report that's just been published about the business models that can be adopted by scholarly publishers and by smaller societies. And I think this is a great report. I don't know if anybody has had the chance to read it, but there were 27 different business models that were identified. I haven't read all of them, but I have read the summary, and it seems that the most pragmatic approach is to find a transitional model that would take the money that's currently in the system that libraries are paying and to use those funds to help transition to fully OA. So I think there's likely to be a variety of models here, and one of the complexities here is that actually if there's 27 different models, the chances are that different organizations will adopt different models, and that there will be some complexity around implementing that. And how do lots of different models to administrate, lots of different negotiations to be had. Somebody needs to do the monitoring, the measuring, the renewing, the reviewing. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that pans out, because everybody's looking for alternative business models. But again, with any kind of change, the knock-on impact is quite often a lot of additional administration or a lot of additional infrastructure and support that's needed for those models. So the session after this one at 11 actually is New Directions in Open Access Business Models. And Lauren Kane is moderating that, so I think we'll hear more about this in that session. So a word about transformative deals. First of all, I'm not an expert. I think that's the first thing to say up front. But I do have an opinion on it. I think, there's evidence to suggest that hybrid journals are a powerful tool in helping us to transition to a new model. And I think that, the Springer Nature have had a lot of success with this in the UK and in other European countries in using the hybrid model to increase the volume of open access. So essentially, I think this is something that we can't, what we can't do is assume that it's better to just recreate a whole new system with hundreds of new journals. We need to use the existing infrastructure to transition to a new model. And I think with the recent announcements with Springer Nature and also Wiley and Project Deal, it's obvious that there's a lot of value in these, but I think the key thing is how long they have taken to evolve. And, there was an article in the Scholarly, or a blog post actually on the Scholarly Kitchen about this, and it was an interview with the VP at Springer Nature who was working on the deal. And she said that it had taken 3 years from the beginning of those conversations to the point at which they were ready to sign a memorandum of understanding. And so if you think about that, yes, that's a great model, and everybody would love to be able to put in place transformative deals with countries and funders. But in fact, it's not practical. To me, it seems like it's not going to be practical to do that with every country and, with every publisher. And so, this is, again, something that will create more complexity and is going to take time. So I think I wanted to just move on a bit more to the actual publishing process. And, I think, coming back to this idea that the research output is increasing and there's so much more volume, these statistics I took from an STM report. And, we now know that there are now about 33,000 journals. It's huge, and 3 million articles a year. And that actually it's continuing to grow. The research output is growing and consistently and even accelerating. And this is sort of causing issues with the publishing process because, in fact, the more output there is, the more content to process. And, in fact, this creates bottlenecks in the system. And I think, a lot of the issues that slow down research publishing are to do with, even if publishers had amazing systems and processes, a lot of the things are outside of our control. And, the peer review process takes time. And quite often the peer review community, as we know, is overburdened. And, this is something that we're all working on. There's lots of initiatives underway. There's sessions later looking at this. But it is the case that we're asking the same people to do huge volumes of assessment of an increased amount of research. And it doesn't seem to be working as well as it should. It's a slow process. So I think there's some signs that the system needs adjusting, and potentially it needs adjusting for an article-based economy with a sound science philosophy. And we never really adjusted that. So we talk a lot about models, but we've still essentially got the same process. I thought a lot about this when I was at Biomed Central. Part of my responsibility was for the BMC series, and that's a set of about 55 journals that publish technically sound science, and the submissions grew year on year by 20%. And we operated a fully open peer review process for the medical journals. And I've blogged about this before, actually, because while I wholeheartedly agree with open peer review and the transparency it brings, it also did, to a certain extent, create some bottlenecks, because there is some reluctance from some reviewers to be identified alongside their review. And for the BMC journals, they are completely open peer review with identified reviewers as well. So I think transparent peer review is one option for this, to help solve this, so you're not identifying the author. But even so, there's only a handful of journals that are offering transparent peer review, and what we'd really like is full and complete transparency. And I spoke to a few reviewers about this, and we essentially had difficulty getting reviewers to agree if English wasn't their first language quite often, because it took them longer to write the review. It took something like 25 minutes longer to write a peer review if you know it's going to be published, because you know it's not going to be copy edited and you want to make sure that it's well written. So there are some barriers to sort of increasing the transparency around peer review. It's not as easy as it may sound, even if we all support it. And so if you add all of these things together, the increase in volume, the rise of the sort of sound science peer review philosophy, and this difficulty with engaging reviewers to review this huge volume of work, then you're really essentially looking at a much slower process. And I think when you go back to that author slide, the speed to publication was much higher up the list than open access, because what people want is they just want to share their results much faster. And so why does it matter? And, again, I don't think I need to tell you this. I think many of you will know this, but it matters because we really need, in some instances, to share that research much faster. And a good example of this are the Zika and Ebola outbreaks, where authors were encouraged to share their work early because it's so important in outbreaks to be able to get the data and the results out quickly. And a study showed that even despite that encouragement, only 3% of the manuscripts that the authors did preprint and did share their work early, and that it was then another 100 days before those papers got published in journals. And, that's too long. And I think that's the crux of, in addition to business models, it's just how long this process takes. So if this is an issue and it takes so long, then what's a good solution to this? And, an easy solution you might think is, well, let's just publish and then peer review. But actually, it's not really to publish and peer review, it's to preprint and peer review is what we're asking, because publishing is clearly different. And I think, this is the way that we're going to be able to speed up the sharing of results, and a lot of sessions today I know will focus on this. But this is really, thanks to the efforts of a lot of people in this room, ASAP Bio, amongst others, and some really great initiatives that have been launched recently, and community preprint servers that are really forging ahead with this. There is more of this going on. So if you preprint and then peer review, and faculty of 1,000 already do this, and I think others are looking at ways to get into this workflow. But essentially, then you may not need to peer review some of this work. So I think this is the thing around the vast volume of content being published is, does all of it need to be peer reviewed? And that's sort of a question I'll leave for people to ponder on, and I think it comes up later, in fact, because a lot of the content that is being published currently are confirmatory studies, or they're not necessarily groundbreaking results. We do need to share them. People are interested in seeing them, but do we need to have peer reviewers looking at them? And dare I suggest, possibly not. So this is a chart thanks to, I believe, ASAP Bio again. So, the growth of preprints, it is relatively slow, and this is sort of showing the volume of manuscripts in the biologies that are preprinted. And this, as at 2018, it was about 2.6%. So it's a very tiny proportion. And, what we'd really want to do is find ways to increase this and to drive up the volume, because it's, in the biologies, there are still reluctancies around this. And I think what we're trying to do is encourage people and get over the old fears that people have that they're going to be scooped, or that maybe the journal won't accept their manuscript when they submit. So ideally, my view, and I should stress actually that most of what I'm saying this morning is my personal view, and my opinions on this, and I'm kind of just probing to push on some of the boundaries. But my personal view is that this should just become part of the normal publication workflow. So as publishers, we should be enabling preprinting ahead of publication and finding ways to do that. And I know that there are many projects recently announced and underway that are doing this, but I think this should be the new normal. And I think the Faculty of 1,000 research model is a fascinating one. And when this launched a few years ago, I remember thinking what a great idea it was. And it is essentially very transparent, and it's immediate preprinting, post-preprint peer review. And funders are also obviously keen on this model, because Gates and Wellcome are using the underlying technology for their own preprint platforms or open publishing platforms. And so I think, this is a good model, but the uptake has been relatively low. And so I think there are some ways that we can adapt and adjust that model to increase the uptake and encourage this kind of publishing behavior. But my guess is that we will see more of this. And I think it's easier for authors where the publication fees are paid centrally. But what are the rest of us doing? Well, so I think, there's a lot of activity in this. And I think Content publishers and preprint servers are collaborating, which I think is really great to see. And, there are a few initiatives which are underway at the moment. I just saw the TRIP initiative announced, press released yesterday from Cold Spring Harbor. And so I think there's innovations in this space that are finding ways to offer authors preprinting opportunities and to link that to the journal submission. And what you'd really want ideally is just a seamless end-to-end process, and every version of the article being available and every peer review that's come along with that version of the article being available. But I don't think, given how behaviours are so entrenched, that it's going to be something we'll make happen overnight. So I think my own view is that actually there will be ways in the not too distant future that preprints will be validated. We can find ways to validate these. And, I'm going to be interested there's a session later today talking about badging and reproducibility. And I think, there is potential for a model where the preprint can be validated with badges or with checks that show people at what the manuscript has undergone, even if it's not peer-reviewed, so that it gives readers and others a level of confidence in what they're reading. And if we do go that route, then I think it really needs to be some kind of collaborative effort, so that all of the key players are working together on this, so you don't have hundreds of different versions of badges, and that it becomes some kind of industry standard that people can build confidence and trust in. So I think, for researchers, and, getting back to what works for researchers is, I think we want to make this very easy for them. And these are just some examples of initiatives that are underway at the moment. So Sneak Peek from Cell Press, InReview, which is the Springer Nature and Research Square collaboration. And, what I think is interesting about this is that for the InReview service, we are offering authors preprinting on submission to Springer Nature journals, so they don't have to submit it separately to another preprint platform. It's done for them on submission if they opt in. About 38% of authors are opting in to that process, and so the volume of manuscripts is building very, very quickly. And for the open access journals, those manuscripts also have versions available as they're updated. And they also have the peer reviews available, but just privately to the authors and not on the public timeline. So one of the manuscript that you see there on the right-hand side, this is a new initiative. It's an Ebola manuscript that's been submitted to Nature Communications last week. And we're offering authors now identifying those manuscripts on submission and saying to the authors, we want you to consider preprinting this and sharing your research. And then we do it for them, so they don't have to do anything. And as you can see, you may not be able to see from this, it clearly shows that there's been an integrity check. And if you hover over that green box, you can see what the check was and what the manuscript has undergone at that point. So I think there's more we can do in this area, and I think it's a value to the researchers. Let's make it easy for them. But the other thing is that it's actually offering an opportunity to publishers. And, I think this is where it comes back to the business models, is everybody's thinking, well, if there's no growth in subscriptions and, what are the opportunities for publishers to develop new business? So you could imagine a world where, authors of preprints quite often need services, and, we're finding this within InReview, that essentially of the manuscripts that opt in, about half of them have problems or issues that really should have prevented them getting into the peer review pipeline in the first place. So a lot of these are language issues, but there are other kinds of things that we know that as this progresses into peer review, it will prevent it from being published, or it will slow it down. So it's going to take it much longer. And so rather than letting that author go through that process and then they've wasted time, they have to go back and work on the manuscript, they have to resubmit it, then why don't we help them with that up front and stop it from getting into the peer review pipeline? So I think some of the tools that I know are being developed, the AI will be will help a lot in this area, and some of the colleagues that I'm speaking to are working on tools that will, in an automated way, assess submissions, rather than humans doing it, which, as we know, is an expensive process, but to be able to detect things that are not quite right with manuscripts so that we can then tell the authors this is something that will prevent this from being published. So what we'd like to do is have a language assessment tool in an automated way on preprint, because 50% of the manuscripts have a language problem or issue, to be able to give the author a report that runs automatically and says, okay, it's like a Grammarly for science. And I know Digital Science have a product called Rightful that does something like this, specifically Grammarly for science based. But others are working on it as well, and I think it's something that would be helpful to authors, but it could also potentially speed up the publication time once things get to journals. So just a little bit about, there was a recent report called, from Kudos, called, I'm supposed to say Kudos, I think, in the US, but from Kudos, called Swimming Upstream. And I don't know if anybody hasn't seen it, it's definitely worth looking at the highlights from that, because one big takeaway for me from that report is that there's a lot of things that publishers already do that could be valuable services for authors in a new model. So we don't know yet, what the new model is going to be, but we do. If we're in a world where pre-printing becomes the norm, which I genuinely believe we will be in the next few years, then there's an opportunity for us to help authors improve those manuscripts. And it wouldn't be too hard to imagine a world where the APC at the end of the publication process isn't necessarily how this is financed, and that in fact authors may choose to improve their manuscript and then not publish it, but to preprint it. So I think it's something, just this evolution of the manuscript and the improvement of it, and then how we illustrate what's happened to that manuscript and demonstrate some integrity in it. That's where I'm really interested in seeing where it goes. So I mentioned earlier there is a session at 1 o'clock on badging and transparency indicators, and I'm hoping that's sort of going to cover this topic because I think it's a really important one. So just in closing, I wanted to just say that, I do think that we're going to hear a lot more about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think we can all guess what the ugly is without me having to say it out loud. And I think it's going to be, constant change for us, but I don't think that that's a bad thing. I actually think, yes, it's adaptation, but there are opportunities in there as well as risks, and that we just need to work hard to find what those are. And I think later today you're going to be hearing more from some of the thought leaders who are advancing these initiatives, and so I'm really looking forward to that. But in the meantime, I think that we can all agree that a transformation is underway. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Rachel Burley. We have a little time for some questions, if you don't. So we have mics around the room. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Of course, to our virtual participants, you are also welcome to type in your questions if you'd like. And feel free to keep the discussion going.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a great talk. I have a question. Thinking about, it's kind of multi-part, so I'm going to try to do this in a way that's not like throwing 3 questions at you at once.
Go for it.
But thinking about the F1000 model and also the nature sort of model here with InReview, which is similar. There's a couple things that comes to mind. First, with F1000, there's no editor. So authors can suggest their own reviewers and then wait for those people to give it a thumbs up, and then it's considered published, leaving lots of papers on the platform that don't get 2 thumbs up and then just sit there. Mm-hmm. And so there's sort of One question would be, are we devaluing curation at a time when there's data coming out saying that researchers are now spending more time finding articles than they are reading the articles? So that's one thing with sort of this new model that you were describing. The other with the Nature, what happens to those papers that are in review that are now have the lovely Nature logo on them as a preprint if they don't get published?
Right. So very good questions. Thank you. So I think I think the faculty of 1,000 model is. I agree that there is this manuscripts that don't get positive peer reviews remain on the platform, and it's clear to everyone that they've not been rejected. Well, I guess they are rejected, right? And I think that's why the uptake has not been as high as it could have been, because actually I think the model itself is brilliant, a brilliant idea. But I think, it's off-putting for authors to think that once that manuscript's been rejected, you can't submit it somewhere else. So I think if the model was adjusted, it would be more successful. And also, the author is paying up front, is my understanding. So the APC is due on submission. So you've paid an article publication charge even if the manuscript is rejected. And so when we were creating InReview, we identified that as being something that could be done slightly better. And so the way that the InReview service works is that while the manuscript is under review at the journal, it has the journal logo. And at the point it's rejected, that is no longer shown. And the peer review timeline is no longer shown, but all of the history is still available to the author through their own private dashboard. So you can see what the peer reviewer said, and you can see the history of the manuscript, but it's not publicly available, and so it effectively becomes a preprint again. And that means the authors can submit it somewhere else. And even if I wholeheartedly believe in full transparency, the uptake of InReview at 40% proves that in fact authors are much more willing to do that if they can resubmit that manuscript somewhere else afterwards.
And they don't have to air the dirty laundry of reviewers explaining why their paper shouldn't be published to future journal editors.
That's
Thank
right.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Jessica.
Thank you for that really interesting talk. I am really interested in this idea of publishers offering services on preprints at the time of their posting in order to address issues before submission to a journal. How do you see the journal submission workflow changing in order to accommodate this extra time? Do you still see preprint posting to InReview occurring at the time of journal submission, or is there some, would it be better for authors to submit earlier in order to capture this more time?
Right. Yes. So I do think in an ideal world, you would have the author submitting the preprint really more or less as soon as they've written it. And what we're trying to do with InReview is drive preprinting uptake by making it part of the current workflow. But ultimately, it really should be the other way around. But until authors are uniformly thinking, I need to preprint this, it's going to be very slow unless we do something radical like this to make it happen. So your question actually about workflow is important, because what we're finding with InReview is that authors do discover that they need services after they've submitted to the journal, and they then have a preprint. But it can potentially interfere with the journal workflow, because let's say they have a manuscript language edited, then the peer reviewers are looking at a different version. So I think it's not ideal to do it this way round, but I think it's the only way that will force some change.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your talk. I work at a school of medicine, and I've been trying for the last year to sell preprints. One of the reasons why is that the more publications that my students and residents can produce means that they can have a better chance at residency and fellowship. And the peer review process for these articles, they have a very short window of time to do scholarship and then publish. So I've really I've tried to push preprints, and it has not worked very well for me in medicine at all. In fact, some of the more senior faculty have said that's a horrible idea. I think it's a brilliant idea. It allows the publication to go out, the manuscript to go out to get some peer review outside of our school. But it also gives the students a DOI, which is really important for those applications. So I just, I don't know in your travels, a better way for me to kind of like get people to do preprints, but I would love to take some students to give me their manuscript and just try it out. In fact, I'm after this conversation, I actually have a manuscript right now. And I'm thinking like maybe I should just be the test case.
Yeah, you should. And we can make that happen. So I do think, I think it's like anything, right? People thought pre-printing in biologies was a horrible idea 5 years ago. And, I remember people saying, well, that's never going to work. And, but that's changing. And I think it will be the same in the clinical and medical sciences. And I think there are more cautions that we need to exercise because you don't want to be pre-printing a manuscript that has something clearly dangerous or even just wacky or has human identifiers. So I think there is work to be done around filtering out and making sure that what gets posted is appropriate. But I think you'll find that changes anyway over time, just because medRxiv has now launched, because the theme of pre-printing is becoming very prevalent and behaviours will change. But we should definitely start with you, and and I think what we've found is that the authors really appreciate having an HTML version of their article and a DOI, as you've mentioned. So once people see the benefits, then they're going to pick it up as a habit. But what we're trying to do now, I think, is just share with people what the benefits are. Thank you.
Hi. I'm Ann Stone with TBI Communications. I was just at a conference where following on to the other very illustrative question, a researcher said, I was told by the senior faculty in charge of my promotion that I needed to publish in this particular journal, and I needed this many results published in this many papers, and that promotion and tenure track committee has so much influence. I wondered, in all of the different experiences that you've had in talking with researchers and talking with all levels of organizations, whether you've had any indication that promotion and tenure committees are now reevaluating what is important to them.
Yeah, I'm sure there's other people in this room who could answer that a lot better than me. But I do think that this is part of the whole complexity around our ecosystem, is that behaviours and habits are really ingrained, and those norms are difficult to break. It takes time. So I think it is. I think there's some indication that some funders are now saying we're not going to use impact factor of journals where you published as in our tenure process, and we'll disregard where you've published. But it is still prevalent. There's still a lot of people who just do what they've been told by their advisor, and that's an issue. But I think it's this kind of drip effect of just constantly pushing the messaging and promoting the benefits and the beepings back that eventually, will start to change behaviour. So I think it's us. We need to make the change happen. We can't rely on it to just sort of, permeate through the research community. I think we need to be driving it. Thank you.
Oh, we have one more?
Hi, Rachel. Theo from Rockefeller University Press. Looking for the journal perspective, I agree that offering more services is definitely going to provide a better quality in terms of preprint of publication. But we have worked a lot to remove roadblocks as submissions, and I wonder, increasing the integrity checks and so on and so forth, and stats, and which is very good, of course, for what we put out online. How would this increase the pickup on preprints or in journal submissions if authors sometimes get discouraged by all this selection up front? So I agree that the outcome and the quality is what we look for, but we are adding yet another roadblock, and how this affects the time to publication eventually if the papers get published, when authors might get back, might have to go back and fix everything for a month even before they actually get considered.
Right. So I do think thank you, that's a good question. And I do think it's slightly different for selective journals and for not, for the sound science journals. So the journals that we currently have on InReview are the BMC series journals. And those journals have an upfront integrity check before, just right at the very beginning of the editorial process. I know that for a more selective journal like yours or the Nature journals, they don't do those checks until quite often accept in principle. So I think, I think there has to be different variations for different models of journal, and that's a really good point. But with the journals that we currently offer this with, the integrity check is happening anyway, and the manuscript, if there are certain things that are not right or not present or, are an issue, then they will get rejected. And so actually, what we need to do is find ways to stop that from happening. And I think, it's not going to be the same process for every journal, but we definitely don't want to put roadblocks in the way. But you could imagine a process where the manuscript is pre-printed, but if it's not suitable for posting because it has issues with it, then one of our plans for InReview is to keep it in a private author mode and then run the sort of assessments that will let the author know you can proceed through peer review, but if you get these things fixed, it's going to be much quicker. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel, for that excellent and very informative talk and for answering a few questions.